Good evening. I was just saying how lovely it is to be in Paris because it's one of the few places where they serve wine before you do a book reading. I thought I would start with just some perspective as to how I came to this idea of onlyness and what the word means and such, and then share one of the stories from the book, one of my favorites, and then open it up for questions. So I think we'll have just that sort of general structure. How many of you have actually picked up the book? Because I know it's been in the market for a little while. Okay, one reader. So for the, and there's my husband raising his hand there. He's a cheater person in the audience. My son didn't raise his hand though, so no pressure or anything. So one of the things that led me to this idea was actually something that started very early in my life. I was supposed to get an arranged marriage when I was 18 years old. I had been raised in an extremely traditional Islamic household, and meaning that my role in my family was very much to marry well. I was the youngest daughter, and from that perspective, it was really just a way to be of service. Like, what's your value in the world? It's this, so this is your way of being of service. But I had grown up with one foot in a very Western perspective, having grown up in America since I was 4.5 years old, going to a public high school, participating in clubs like Future Business Leaders of America, believe it or not, as well as helping run the newspaper and so on. But then coming home and cleaning the house and cooking and doing all the things that I was responsible for doing from a perspective of being a good daughter. So one day, I'm going off to community college, I come home, and literally, before I even get to the door, I realize something big is going on because I can smell the aroma of biryani being made. So it's a buttery chicken rice dish with the masala smell, 20 feet away kind of thing. You can tell something's big, and that's sort of a feast meal. And as I approach, I also notice the house is not only full of biryani smells, but it's full of all my aunties and uncles, gathering together, as it turns out, to celebrate the fact that I was getting, the marriage I was supposed to be having was finally arranged. And so I had gone to my uncle during this event and said, so of course you've asked the groom if I can get an education. And it was the one sort of thing I had sort of tugged on my uncle's sleeve if he could please make sure he asked. Knowing that my mother was not so much a proponent of this idea, she had other objectives, and my father was long gone out of the picture. So he was basically the main negotiator, and so I'd gone to him. He's a pretty Western guy. So I was like, of course you'll ask. And so this night I go to him and say, well, so how'd that conversation go? And he said, well, your mother would not let me ask this question, so you'll have to wait until after you're married. And knowing enough about my power structure in that relationship, it would mean I would have to wait at least a year, maybe two. Unbeknownst to my family, I had actually applied to UC Berkeley. I had already gotten a 1-year deferment. So in my mind, this was a really big deal that we get this negotiated soon, and instead of missing out on this other opportunity. And so I waited out of respect. I waited until the larger family left, and I'm left alone with my mother, and I said, now this is where the FBLA part of me shows up in this conversation. I am the product, so you cannot do this deal without me. And I proceed to do this thing that I don't even think is going to last more than a minute. I go grab a grocery box that used from the Indian grocery store, and I put in 5 books, literally my college books, that I happen to have with me that day. And I go down the hall to pick up an outfit because I'm trying to show her I'm going to leave. And I don't think of toothbrush or anything because, of course, I'm not supposed to even make it to the door. And so I'm kind of surprised when she lets me walk out the door. And then I had to go, at the end of the driveway, okay, now what do I do? Because she hasn't stopped me yet. And so at that moment, I went to the most logical place I could think of, which was a donut house. Because, of course, carbs must be involved in any high-stress moment. And so I wait at the donut shop for all of, an hour, hour and a half. I call home, and I'm like, okay, so you've relented, right? And she's like, no, you will obey me because I am in charge. And I thought, okay, this might be slightly harder than I thought it was going to be. And honestly, I'm still thinking the next day the situation will get resolved. No, not the next day, and then not the next day after that. And so literally 30 years have gone by, and that's kind of stands the state of our relationship. So one of my observations, and the reason I'm sharing this, incredibly personal story to set up my more business-focused sort of perspective, is in that moment, I realized that they weren't actually seeing me, the individual. They were only seeing this silhouette of a person. In this case, Indian Islamic woman whose job is to be X. And they weren't noticing my own hopes and dreams, my own wishes. And I really thought, gosh, that's wrong and a mistake and so on. But then I show up at work, and Apple Computer was one of the first places I worked. I was still working my way through college. And I remember, because I was part of a little strategy team, so we were a small little group, they said, hey, we're having a meeting, everyone's invited, we're going to solve, and I can't remember the business context enough to remember the specific, but it was like, we're going to go solve for X, and I showed up at this meeting so excited because I was like, oh, I get to participate in a meeting, and of course I'm like 22 years old and still uncredentialed. Actually, I'm like 20 at this point, and thinking, wouldn't it be like great if I could come up with an idea that these people would value? And so I've actually like researched, because I'm that person, and come up with questions that I might want to ask, come up with things that have already worked or not worked. And so I'm like, I'm super ready. And as soon as they say, okay, who has ideas, my hand goes up, and I realize it takes a minute or two for me to realize, but I realize no one's making any eye contact with me. They're only making eye contact with the MBA type people in the room. I thought, maybe I need to work at my communications, or maybe I need to figure out how to present myself better or something. And yet what I noticed in 25 years now of working in major companies, boardrooms and C-suites of Nokia and Apple and Autodesk and Walmart and GE, is in every room there are only a few people who get seen. Sometimes it's because of title, so we're only acknowledging people who are, the boss. Sometimes it's based on who has the most amount of credentials for that specific topic, so we're expecting that answer to come from an engineer and not from marketing, and so on. But almost always that dominant group was male. Almost always that dominant group were the people who were always in charge. And so the people who had more of those fresh and new voices were not often being heard. And that's when I noticed that in all these different meetings, 25 years of sort of witnessing this over and over again, it had very little to do with communications. It had very little to do with persuasion, and almost always to do with the status of the person, them being seen by the silhouette of who they were and not actually the soul. And so that's why I started coming up with, what is it we're not seeing? Why are we seeing the person through an outside lens? Why are we seeing the other instead of that only thing that someone can bring? And so 6-7 years ago or something, I was working on how value creation was changing and really trying to talk about the models and business models that were going on. And I was saying this could be an opportunity with so much going on that platforms would allow people to recognize the young and not just the established, or the women in the room and not just the men, or people of color and not just the white people, and so on in each room. And so that's when I started saying, what is it that allows us to celebrate that which each of us brings? Potentially all 7.5 billion of us on this earth. And started just pondering that question. And around that same time, lots of work has been done to say, networked models would allow more power to exist. So Clay Shirky, if you remember, wrote Here Comes Everybody, which was a brilliant book, 2008, to talk about how networks will allow more people to gather together and have power. So people were starting to say, here comes the future. But no one was actually saying, okay, would it just be about same person, same power status, and everything's now different? Or was there something actually that needed to change from the perspective of the individual? And to be quite honest, I didn't know the answer to that for quite some time. And that's one of the reasons I started doing the research that I did starting about 5 years ago. And starting to just find stories of people who are using network power to do change, then trying to figure out, okay, what are you doing? And then what are you doing that's repeatable, that if I were to try to follow in your footsteps, you as a pioneer using this networked model, what is it I might need to know so that I could actually duplicate that path? And it turns out, and that's one of the reasons why this book took a little longer to write. I'll get to one of the stories next. I actually thought, well, this can't be that hard because I'll just ask the person and they'll tell me and I'll write it down. That'd be good. And it turns out none of the actual people that I talked to actually knew what they were doing right, because they're all pioneers. And so they're using a distributed network way of getting things done. They're doing it by braille, meaning they're sort of figuring it out as they're going along. And so when I would ask each person, well, what are you doing right? You know, in whatever way I asked that, they would tell me, and I'd sit there and go, that doesn't feel like my own gut instinct would be like, that's not right. So let me go find more examples and then see if I can find the common thread. And so I thought what was going to be, you know, finding 25 stories to write 20 or maybe 30 stories to write 20 or something ended up becoming almost 300 case studies to find the repeatable patterns, and that would allow us to talk about this. In fact, Franklin Leonard, who's in chapter 5 of the book, is one of my favorite stories because he actually said one thing about why it worked, and then I wanted to circle back to him and say, oh, I don't actually think it's that. But I wanted him to agree, so I was like, how do I say to someone, I don't think it's that, but I want you to agree it's something else, you know? And we had a really good, rich conversation for it, which I'm hoping to share with you too. How's the sound, by the way, in the room? Everything okay? Good. I should have asked that like a long time ago. So Franklin Leonard ends up showing up in Hollywood at the ripe young age of like 24 years old. He's gone to Harvard University. He's worked for a congressperson. Goes to McKinsey, gets fired from McKinsey, and because he doesn't enjoy his job at all there, and the team's dissolving, so he takes off. And he's literally binge watching, so now he's like unemployed. He's binge watching Netflix for an entire weekend and realizes one of the few things he absolutely loves is movies, storytelling, filmmaking. And so he gets this idea of, I'll just show up in Hollywood and I'll figure it out from there. And he shows up as this incredibly junior person, and he describes what it was like when he would then be able to share his ideas at the table. So his perspective. So he says he pitched an idea. Let me just see if I can get it. Yeah. For years, there was a conventional wisdom about the idea that you can't sell female-driven action films, says Franklin. I remember when I was working at Universal, I read The Hunger Games. You remember how big The Hunger Games was, right? Okay, so it's really important. And said, hey, we should buy this. He kept trying, but was told, it doesn't work, leave it alone. And then Color Force actually ends up buying it. And then he goes on to say, I'm telling them, I'm trying to sell them on black actors, and they say, no, you can't sell black actors abroad. When you say, and Franklin explains, when you say, what about Will Smith? The response is, well, that's the exception, which proves the rule. Well, what about the fact that Coming to America made 300 million foreign when it came out? Well, that was Eddie Murphy, and that was a different thing. And he asks, just how many assumptions do you need to disprove before you admit that maybe the model itself is wrong? But so he goes on for a little bit trying to, he finds ideas, right? Even as a junior person, one of the most interesting things I learned in that particular research was how much junior people have to be the first people to read scripts. So they literally are the first pass, but they have the least power in the room. And so then they have to basically write up, like, here's why this story is interesting. And they have a very particular sort of protocol of how to do it, and then they pitch their bosses. But their bosses are looking for very specific things. So if it doesn't fit into that sort of narrow band of what they're looking for, the most unusual scripts are least likely to be seen. So Franklin is sort of beating his head against the wall, and he himself just really notices that there's all sorts of people who have original ideas, like he meets them out in the world, but then he notices that in Hollywood, almost everyone has to get to be in Hollywood to sort of hustle the game to get their script seen. And he's like, well, who's going to be able to quit their job, right, and be in Hollywood? Or who's going to be able to not take care of their kids, right? So he's like, okay, so we're only going to see the group of people who can afford to hustle and be in this one city. We're not seeing the fuller range. So he ends up at one point doing something against, privately, not wanting to be public about it at all. He sends an email to everyone he's met in his first year in Hollywood. And literally goes through his calendar and like, oh, I had coffee with this person, and I had lunch with this person, and gathers all the emails and writes one email, but he puts it under an alias because he figures if his bosses find out he's doing it, he's subverting the power structure and hierarchy and everything, right? And his bosses are going to think, by the way, you're not good at your job because you have to ask for help. So he sends it under this alias called Blacklist, which is kind of a play to Hollywood and the things they've done to people in the 50s. And all he says is, and he himself says, this was not supposed to be a big deal. This was like literally me getting help. And he says the transaction is, send me all the scripts you've seen within the last year that haven't been put into production that you love, and I will roll back up the data with everyone who participates and give you a tabulated list. And he thinks maybe half the people will participate or whatever, and he sends it to about 80 people. 90-some people respond within 24 hours. He does his, now remember, McKinsey skills, right? So sits there and does a thing, sends it out, and goes on vacation for 2 weeks. So prints out the top 5 scripts, thinks he solved his problem, comes back to, this is back when actually people took vacations and logged off the internet, and he comes back and the same list has been forwarded to him hundreds of times. And he's like, wow, this is amazing. People are super excited about it. And what was the best part was he kept hearing stories of people who, in traditional terms, are powerless peons in Hollywood, were able to convince their bosses to be able to accept scripts that they had previously turned down. Really unusual scripts. So I'm trying to think some of them were Slumdog Millionaire, Juno, which was a story of the pregnant teenager, right, which was considered quite controversial at the time. What's a more recent one that came after? Because this has gone on for almost 10 years. Moonlight, I'm thinking Moonlight. King's Speech. And he actually found the original description of how somebody on his team had written up the King's Speech. Stuttering guy. It's a ridiculous thing when you actually just think about what is that script about. So what basically people were doing was saying, hey, it's not just my opinion. All these other people think so too. And Franklin is doing this under an alias now for several years, but isn't really clear each time he does it if he'll continue. Because he's like, as long as I get the benefit kind of thing, I'll continue doing it. And at one point, he ends up, I wonder where that section is. Yeah, somebody says, he's getting pitched, and I'm trying to think where he was. Did I write this? Yeah, he's at Leonardo DiCaprio's film. I can't say his name, but I got that. And he gets this call from one of the most powerhouse people in the industry. And he's getting this pitch basically saying, hey, we really want Leonardo to be in this film, blah, blah, blah. And this is a direct quote, listen, I have it on really good authority. This is going to be #1 script on next year's Blacklist. And he understandably refers to this moment, which I just loved when he said it to me, as a clue, right? Because it was now starting to be used by the powerhouse people as a way to navigate this new form of power, right? So all these people who are powerless peons have now got leverage in a way that literally the powerhouse people are now using. And just to give you a sense of outcomes, I actually want to just reference it very specifically. So by 2015, he had issued a blacklist for 10 years with staggering results both artistically and financially. Nearly 300 of the 1,000 blacklist scripts, so again, all indexed over the years, have been produced, so that's huge, earning over $25 billion worldwide. They've collectively received 223 Academy Award nominations and won 43 Oscars as a result. Pretty good hit rate. 4 of the past 6 Best Picture winners, 10 of the last 14 screenwriting winners, and 3 of 2014 screenwriting nominees were blacklist scripts. So astronomical results, right? And the best part, actually, at least for Franklin, was that in the first 8 years, the blacklist top 5 scripts were submitted by what he calls outsiders, writers not living in Los Angeles nor represented in the industry. So definitely new voices, right, coming into the world. Now, the reason that Franklin's story is so important is it shows how people who were, first of all, at the script level being treated with otherness, right? So these people who have the freshest ideas for what could be the stories that represent full humanity are now included and seen. That's the sort of one level of this vignette. And the other is that Franklin himself is now getting to do this thing that he absolutely loves to do, which was from the very beginning about great scripts, great stories. He was a kid from Georgia whose mom was a single mom, and he just wanted the stories that he had grown up seeing to be reflected on that screen, not just the ones that a very select group of people wanted to see. And he wanted especially, he views movies as almost a near religious experience, meaning, you know, the church used to be one way in which communities used to be united, and films are another way, that in that moment that you're experiencing something together, you're deeply united in emotion. And he goes, what if we could find more ways of people to see themselves and one another on film? So he embodies to me, and his story embodies to me what onlyness really is, which is that each of us stands in a spot in the world only you stand in. It's a function of your distinct history and experience as well as your visions and hopes. It is what each of us distinctly brings into the world. It is the true definition of originality, which is actually interesting that there are so many books on innovation, originality, originals, I mean Adam Grant's work, Malcolm Gladwell's Outliers, Matt Ridley's Where Do Ideas Come From, just it's sort of the most iconic books on innovation, don't address the fact that innovation cannot happen by the person who has no power. So well over, if you just count gender alone as one way in which, you know, one group of people does not have power, then you could say you've taken about 50% of the ideas off the table. And yet the dominant body of work around innovation never acknowledges that bias factor and what are the power structures that keep things in play. And it's important to realize that that is actually the issue. Adam Galinsky and Joe McGee, who are two professors out of Columbia School, based out of New York, had done this really good piece of research that basically said, they originally started studying it as gender dynamics and realized actually it was all about power dynamics. And what they found is that power and status act as self-reinforcing loops. And the people who have power at the table are the people who are listened to. So this completely affirms like my lived experience and probably yours too, right? That for all those different tables I was at, I was like, why are only some people being noticed? And so this research kind of backs that up, which is power and status ends up determining who gets listened to and therefore who gets development time, right? So if most of us show up to the table with a nascent idea, we really don't have it fully formed. But if the group of people around us kind of says, yeah, it's been done before, that's not worth doing, then there's nobody sort of incubating it to the next level, which is to say, hey, I could see you doing that, but you need to go talk to so-and-so, or you're missing this perspective, right? So nascent ideas, all ideas come not fully formed, they come in sort of infant state, and they need that context to kind of help shape them into fully fledged ideas so they can actually go have an impact. And so Galinsky's work basically says if only the people who have power and status already get listened to, then they get, you know, loop-de-loop, the self-reinforcing loop. Those people get more power, more listening to, more outcomes, and then they get more power. How many of us have experienced that, right? And then we're like, we would like that same shot, please. And so what I was noticing in these, in this is that it offers us a new way of power, right? So Franklin did not do this by himself. And in fact, when I asked Franklin, so what did you do right? You know, one of the like questions I asked everybody, he was like, oh, I shone a bigger light on the scripts that deserved attention. Because Hollywood was sorting by what films could make money, he said, I basically asked a better question, right? Which is, what do you love? And then I helped direct attention to that. I said, well, if that were true, if it was just about a bigger light, somebody could have funded a bigger light. Right? Like if you were a Hollywood producer, you could have asked that same question, funded it. That didn't feel right. I go, what else did you do? You know, so we kept poking around. And finally it occurs to us that we're using the power of us more than we're using the power of an individual, first of all. And we're using the power of us as a sort of a different lever point. So us gathered together around this idea believe it's important. We don't have to be powerful individually, but we believe this idea is powerful, and we can essentially collectively put our foot on that. And that would suggest something about critical mass, but also about critical yeast, that we can all believe this idea is the idea that matters, and organized in the right way, then able to create some more, growth behind that idea. So that was the Franklin story and a way of showing community and what it takes. Franklin specifically really did a beautiful job of reframing how an industry could even work, right? He actually challenged the fundamental premise of what was the question that was even going on, and he didn't even realize he was doing it when he wrote the email. He wrote the email like late at night, and but I loved it that it was born out of his interest of what do you love? Let's stop worrying about how do we make money. What do you love? What are the ideas that completely captivate you? And how do we start to use love as a different orienting system? So he super excites me on that front. And then I guess I will share also that the big difference I was noticing when I was writing this, right, is Lean Ed had come in about 5 years ago, is this is not a message more of lean in, it's a message of lean on. How do we learn to belong to a shared idea? How do we learn how to form a community of people? The word community is so overused nowadays, and especially in the US right now, Facebook is in front of Congress. The CEO of Facebook is testifying in this really lightweight way. And he's going to use the word community a whole bunch of times in that testimony. But what he means when he uses the word community, I would translate to be eyeballs that I can monetize. Because he doesn't actually care if we're connected. He only cares that we're on his platform, right? A platform that can actually distort whether or not we feel connected with each other. But we actually know what the original word of community is that sense of fellowship that we have around something. It can be religious, it can be family, it can be around work things that we care about, it can be personal passions. It can be a series of different ways in which we can organize community. And so we're returning back to that word of how do we actually organize in a way and belong to one another and with one another in something that we think matters. And then that ends up providing us a nice way of us being able to mobilize and act as one. And it reminds me actually of, when I left home that day and I walked out, a couple days later, I'm now like couch surfing and trying to figure out like what am I going to go do next. And I finally admit to someone at the college what's going on. And he says, well, that's what community college is all about, for you to get an education. And so here all of a sudden we have this shared perspective, which is that despite my gender, despite who I was born to kind of thing, that I care about getting an education, so does this place. And so he literally walked me around campus and said, let's go get you a couple jobs. So I got an accounting job for Friday afternoons at the History Museum, which was on campus. I got an ushering job, which was Saturday nights, paid really well, and I could also watch people speak, so that's kind of funny to think about now. Got a basic programming job that I could do in flexible hours, and so on. So literally picked up 4 jobs in the course of an afternoon. And then he also walked me down to the bursar's office and asked them to loan me, I don't know, I think it was $500. And I remember saying to the person, like, I don't think you should loan me $500. Like, I'm not good for it. Because I was like, how am I going to do this? But right in that moment, I really did have. It's an interesting thing about community is you find it as you are it. And so right in that moment, I had actually found exactly the group of people who cared about the same thing as me and helped me to go manifest that. So it took me 12 years to finish an education, but I did manage to keep going and get to that other side. And the reason I care so much about this idea and why it so matters that all of us get to count is because this is the key to innovation. I've been doing innovation for years and years for every major company. They all talk about how incredibly important it is to them, to their economy, to the outcomes, to their own people's growth, and yet they disregard so many of their own ideas. And a couple years back, there was a piece of research by Kareem Lakhani, which has brought this home for me, and I'll wrap with that, and then we can take questions. Kareem had done what they call a meta-analysis, so 166 other pieces of research, and figuring out what did all those research things roll up into. So he studied the scientific discovery kind of field. And so 166 pieces of research studying 12,000 participants. Who were the people who were the innovators at the end of that? And he found nearly 100%, so it was like 99 point something percent, were people that he called left fielders. Kareem's at Harvard, and his expertise is in open source stuff, so I love that he called it left fielders. But then you just read into who is a left fielder according to Kareem Lakhani, and it was almost all women or people of color. It was the especially young who were highly disregarded, or women or people of color. And so he spent majority of the paper then talking about women are the most undertapped resource for innovation. If we could only listen to that one group, let alone the other groups, it would really change things. And of course, that's true across every industry. I just think about every solution, and his stuff was in science, the piece he was researching, so of course things like Alzheimer's and cancer come to mind. Like, what are all the things we're not solving because we're not funding or paying attention to these new voices who might have completely new ideas and approaches? And will, right, undoubtedly will, because each of us stands in a spot in the world only you stand in. You're gonna, of course, have a new take. And I just wonder what else could be there. So this is both an opportunity to talk about how do we unlock capacity of each of us from a dignity perspective, then how do we actually add value to the world in a way that each of us can, and of course it will show up in terms of innovation and economic output. So I just see a big through line through those things. They're completely interlinked. As soon as we open up one part of this capacity, we'll benefit on these multiple levels. So that's why I cared so much about writing this work and kept persevering, even though it was incredibly challenging. And I'm happy to be on the backside of having now written book number 3. Yeah, and happy to be here tonight. So what questions come to mind? Yeah, so actually, I want to turn around the question for a second and ask, how would you define innovation?
I define innovation by a fresh way of looking at things. Because I don't think that there's anything necessarily new, but it's a fresh approach. So it's Hamilton, but it's in color and it's with music. So it's just a fresh way of thinking of history.
Right, so it can be a how, it can be a what, right? It's not limited. So most people actually define it as a very specific what and less a how. And yet, to me, the how turns out to be incredibly important in the definition of innovation. How, to me, manifests the what and the why. And so, in fact, my first book was called The New How, and people often think about that as being an incredibly tactical naming convention. I'm like, actually, in the how is how everything actually becomes real. And so I find that in focusing in that, I can actually get to the macro level. Instead of the theory level, I can get to the execution level. So that's why I have such a focus on that. So I define innovation much like you do, which is what is the fresh take? And it can be teeny tiny or it can be gigantic, right? And the form of that is less consequential than somebody's ability to add value into the world, whatever that looks like. It can be in your family life, it can, it can be the way in which you get the kids off to school on time, right? There can be a way in which you find a distinct way of doing something that is entirely an innovation that hasn't been done by anyone else. Yeah, so one of the things that we're getting to, right, is that companies right now are optimized to efficiently make the thing we already know how to make. And what innovation generally is about untapping creativity at different levels, right? So I always say most of our business structure is aimed at figuring out how to make money off of the known things. So the wheel, we know the wheel, so we need to build a car company, and then we're going to build an entire, apparatus around the car company, right? So that's how this company is going to make money. But what about the next wheel? Because that's what we're actually not doing well. So a couple of things that I just kind of talk about in a practical way. One is, can you set up sub-teams within an organization that are responsible for doing innovation? So one example is Google, that they did with Google X. So they basically said the job of Google X is to basically come up with a whole bunch of pilot ideas, and we're going to decide general domains. We're going to decide driverless cars. We're going to decide Wi-Fi for everyone, right? Like just very, very broad charter. And then what they started looking at is who in the world might be interested in solving that, and they really did an open call. And so you had people who were raising their hand from all around the world then kind of saying, oh, I'm really interested in this particular weird thing that might be fitted in with driverless cars. And they brought those people in and said, okay, you form teams, go. Now, it's such a strange model when we think about how most organizations sort, right? So most of us sort by a box. So if you think about it as, I will then write out a job description, And I will think of everything I need to know 5 years from now in order to hire that person, right? What will that person do? And I will try to spec it all out despite not knowing that person even exists. And then I will look for them and then place them in that job and ask them to stay within those parameters. It's sort of a funky way that we actually hire. We're actually hiring for efficiency. We're hiring for the box. We're actually hiring for the silhouette. So in fact, I remember when social media was really new, and I was, active enough at it to be in the field, and somebody sent me a resume and said, I want someone who's really experienced in social media. And so the way they had written the job description was with 10 years experience. And it was maybe like 2 years in. So it was the most ridiculous job description, right? And I was like, you have to hand this back to the person because you sound ridiculous, right? And I said, what you actually need to do is use social media, post and say we want some experience, and have people submit using social media, because the advanced person will actually understand what that question is, what they could do for the job. And people submitted all sorts of crazy videos and ideas and contests and stuff. And it was like, oh, well, just show me, right? So it was a completely different model, which is instead of me telling you what you're going to do, show me what you could do for us. And it caused people to show up with all the character and personality and everything, right, that they could bring to the table. And people ended up finding the fit, not based on a silhouette, but based on the soul. And so to me, I think there's a way of doing talent modeling that is more around that recognize that each of us actually have sort of a creative take, whatever that looks like. Even in accounting, we could have our own take, right, of whatever that looks like. So creativity not being just those disciplines that we think about as creative fields, but every way in which each of us can be creative. Does that help?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so there were certain friends who wanted me to go to Corsica. What did I keep saying? Christelle is one of my dear friends that I met once I moved here, and she would be like, oh, so this weekend I'm going to, and I'd be like, oh, I'm so behind. So, and so that I'd be like, no, I can't go. And later on, I'm like, no, I'm like going, I should have gone to Corsica, right? Like, if you get invited, go to Corsica. So I think there were two things. One is I completely underestimated how much the pioneers who were doing this new type of work could actually articulate what they were doing right. Like, I just completely misguessed that. And so it got me more and more, like my bit was in my teeth thing, but then I'm like, I'm going to figure this out, and I'm going to figure it out before my deadline of the book hits, So I'm now making my project so much harder than it needs to be, but I'm not going to change the deadline of the book or to the degree I couldn't. The other thing, and this is more pragmatic, is so that part I didn't expect, and that was just me not knowing enough as I started a project, which I always say you need to lie to yourself a certain amount on any big project, because you have to be able to tell yourself you're going to be able to do it. So there's a amount of self-deception that's necessary and healthy to be able to say, I can totally do this, and then find out later maybe didn't know what the heck you were talking about. But then you're in it, and then you're like, I will figure it out. But the other part was I had never done storytelling before. So for those of you that read business authors, here's how they normally write. Thesis, 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 minor little story, thesis, thesis, thesis. They're hearing themselves talk. You're laughing, but it's true, right? And then storytelling in this way is really quite different, right? You really need to get into the mind of the person and tell the story from their perspective. And to the degree that you need to insert your voice in to say, here's what you're noticing, reader, here's what you need to be paying attention to. You want to do it so you're not directing too much. You're just guiding, right? You don't want to feel forced. And I had never done that before. And so just in terms of an art, that is such an art to tell good storytelling. And I don't even know, I'm not trying to say I did, but I certainly tried. And that was just hard. Like at one point, if you ever go through my Instagram, like you will see entire stories that I wrote one way, and then I was like, okay, that's not working. And sometimes I would try to keep like typing it, and I'd be like, okay, that's not working. So finally I would print it and take little, like almost like down to the sentence level, and sit there and see if I could arrange it on the kitchen table here in Paris. Or sometimes there used to be there's one of these rooms that's out here that has old books on it. I don't think it went through the renovation from what I could tell. But I'd just be like, can I borrow that room for a little while? Because I just needed like a big surface. And then I would take the glue stick, and see if I could lay it out in a new way. And then would that work, right? And then I would pen in sections. So storytelling was just a brand new art. And I respect it so much more now when I read other people. I'm like, oh my God, that probably took a lot of work. I think the big piece is, so here's what I did for this book is I believe distributed networks are the way to disrupt the power structure of hierarchical organizations that right now have too much patriarchy built in. So I'm like, okay, I have to suspend disbelief for a second and actually say, if you were gonna go like close your eyes and build the right thing, what would it look like? And that's what I gave myself permission to write here. What I still need to do is figure out how to tell existing organizations, which I'd been speaking to for so many years, right? I mean, that's been my work. Okay, how would you hack your own culture to kind of create these kinds of outcomes? And that would be the next logical step. So if you're talking to more established firms, how do you create culture change? Because that's the key, right? Culture is the context in which each of us operate. Right now, all the context basically says you get to live in a box. It's pretty pervasive. It's 150 years of management theory, all baked into existing organizations. So I'm actually interested in sort of studying okay, who's the existing firms who are doing those things, and what are they doing, and maybe figure out what could be those levers of change. And if you could almost do it at a micro level, like, Christelle, what are you doing? Alicia, what are you doing? Sarah, what are you doing? And those are 3 names I know in the room. I could pick on all of you. But then sit there and go, what is it that you're doing right? And how are you trying to solve that problem, and what works, kind of thing? From being more inclusive at meetings to figuring out how to tear down the boundaries between organizational silos to, so just how are you recruiting and managing people so they feel like they're seen as an individual. So you can imagine all the pieces of sort of a traditional HR cycle and see what people are doing to kind of create a better, more formative culture. That's sort of a big project that I think that could be fun though. But I haven't talked to current transition piece yet. Yes. Yeah, so one of the things I'm really fortunate about is that I have a pretty good network of people. I mean, that just happens to be one of my onlyness elements of life. I tend to keep a pretty varied group of people in my life. And so when I was looking for any particular type of story, sometimes I would know them and I'd be like, oh, that might be the right person. And then I would know other people to ask, like who else could be similarly doing this kind of work. So, and I think that's how I've always found everything. Like it's staying in networks of people, high trust networks, and saying, okay, this is the next business problem I'm interested in solving. What would, who's actually working on it, kind of thing. Yeah. So that's why going from 30 to 300 was not the most insane thing, because I actually knew them, or I knew of them, kind of thing, through the network. So Franklin, in fact, the guy Bob Safian, who used to run Fast Company, I was telling him the project I was working on and some of the things I'd learned. And I said, and I'm looking for, and I did, I just go, I'm looking for this next thing, like who's done a reframing problem. And he goes, oh, totally know the guy, and introduced me to Franklin. And so it was word of mouth, and then I just do like 10, 15 interviews per person to try to get to what was the story. And then sometimes I would discard the story because it didn't work. So that's why the project was, crammed. Yeah. I researched 300 to get to 20 in the book. I did, one of the first things I did was I had decided from the very beginning I wanted to do a what not to do story. One of the things that, so now I've written 2 books and I do a great deal of work inside firms. One of the things I notice is unless you tell people what it's not, people can't hear what it is. And it just, that's the truth. Like you kind of, if you're hearing something brand new, even if it's as wise as whatever, you can't hear it until you hear the contrary. So I did exemplar A, then a what not to do using Stacey London's language from fashion, and then exemplar B, that would show the advanced version of the idea as a construct. So then I had to also pick like who was the story I was going to pick on, if I could call it that, to point out what didn't work, and that was challenging because of course then can I take a microphone to you and tell you why you failed? Like it was just terrible. So choosing those stories was more interesting, more challenging. And then what were the second part was, what were the stories, other stories? Oh God, it's like, for people who have read the book, because I know some people in the room have read the book, anyone else want to share a story that they want me to talk about?
Black Girls Code.
Black Girls Code. So Kimberly Bryant, who is an engineer, graduates from Vanderbilt University, shows up at her first job. Her manager introduces her this way. With Kimberly Bryant, we get a twofer. And what he was pointing out was that Kimberly was a black woman in tech. He was otherizing her the instant she walked in the door, not pointing out what she came to build and why she was good at building those things. And so Kimberly works away in tech for many years, not making much headway, but kind of advancing in her career. And at one point realizes her daughter goes to a summer camp and gets otherized in that setting also, and gets told basically she's not that good of a coder, even though she's one of the most advanced coder. The teacher basically ignores her. And she's thinking, and this is actually one of the reasons I love this story, is she's thinking, I thought that if like a few of us broke through, that the entire thing would change. And it turns out actually, no, that's not actually true. And the few and the first and the only and the exceptions tend out not to actually show up with enough force, because actually they get caught up in the existing system. So they almost always conform to the existing system, right? Just to survive. And so she realizes she has to try something else. She ends up starting to train these girls who are 8, 9, 10 at the kitchen table, borrows computers, old computers, writes programming stuff on the back of pieces of paper, and figures out how to teach these girls to code. She's now doing it on weekends and evenings. Other moms, other parents start to say, hey, can I borrow that curriculum? Can I borrow that computer? Can you teach me how to do this? It's now in many cities, including Johannesburg. You can even start a chapter here in Paris if you want, because she's now figured out how to create the program and scale it. I think so far I think we're up to 10,000 girls who have been through the program. Her goal is to get to 1 million by 2040, and I think she's really working at creating scale behind that. But in fact, when she was asked how she should name the program, she was super worried about it. And somebody pointed out, if what you're going to do is teach black girls to code, maybe just call it Black Girls Code. But you have to understand what she's doing in that moment to assert value to the word black, to say that it is good, is to take back a definition from society, in America especially, that it does not view it as good. And to assert your own worth into that and say, no, I get to define it even if it means redefining it, right? And to claim that. So she's made huge progress in that effort, and I think really creating a nice disruption in the field of tech. Well, and it's Kimberly and Franklin, both of them being black. You might think the book is about black people. It's not. 31% of the book is white men, because 31% of the population is white men. I actually sat there with a grid, believe it or not, to make sure that I had a representative audience of multiplicity. And I've had more people say to me, this is a book about women. And I'm like, isn't it weird that when you see them represented at the same level as overall society, you think it's a book about women? This is what normal is, people, right? And I'm just kind of surprised that people need to be told that. But I've actually been told that this is a book for women because it includes women. I'm like, actually, no, it's a book for everyone because it includes everyone. And it's sad that we can't see it when it's not there, right? I do this thing where I flip over a book now. I've been doing it for years. It's a really obnoxious habit because I know the author, right? Like they'll send me something and I'll flip it over and be like, how many women did they get to endorse the book? Just the back jacket copy. Do this. This is like a fun little test. And you'll notice they're almost all men. So the way we do authority is men, mostly all white men too. And so I'm like, I usually won't read it. Even if it's a book I actually want to read, I'm like, nope, you've decided it's only for white men? Good. I will promise that I don't need to give it more attention because white men don't need more attention. I will go find more other fresh new voices to pay attention to. We ought to be a little bit more discriminating about that process, right? About who do we listen to, who do we consider authority to be. I have a friend who's a strong journalist and thought they were being extremely gender fair, and at one point did an audit on themselves, like how much are they representing women as authorities and so on, and were very surprised at their own answers. So despite their own intention, they were at something like 20-some%. And then it's just one of those things. You get better when you track it. You get better when you say your intention is to actually find those other voices, because they do exist. They're not invisible. Just because you can't see them doesn't mean they don't exist, which is often the presumption. Thank you. Thank you for being here tonight.